All right, and we are live. Hi, I'm Philip Lee. I'm with the Stewart County Community College Marketing and Public Relations Office, and I am here with Janice Northerns, local liberal resident and author. And I'm also here with Rachel Coleman, who is the Executive Director of Marketing and Public Relations at Stewart County Community College. And we're here today with Janice to talk about her upcoming event here at the college on Thursday at the Showcase Theater at 7 o'clock, and she'll be reading excerpts from her new book. How are you, Janice?
Oh, how am I? Sorry, I was like, I need to show the book. I'm doing great. How about you guys?
We're doing well. So let's get this things a little started. Let's talk a little bit about you. Give us a little bit of brief history of you.
Well, I'm sort of a late bloomer, late to everything. I went to college late. I came to my love of poetry late. I hated poetry in high school. Like I didn't really get it. I was kind of a lazy student. And then I went to college in my 30s. And I went to college with the idea of either majoring in journalism or English because I wanted to write. I tried some poetry. My main creative writing professor, Dr. Walter McDonald, encouraged me to stick with poetry. And he did it by saying, you're really good at this. You need to forget the fiction. I think what he meant was like, you're not that good at fiction. You need to focus on poetry. So that kind of steered me down that path. I wrote quite a bit in graduate school. Then we moved to Kansas and I sort of dropped all of that because I got busy with jobs, kids, things like that. So I took a 20-year break from writing poetry pretty much. I wrote a little bit during that time, and I wrote a lot of things for the newspaper, which the three of you all know about. But about 4 years ago, I had been wanting to get back to writing for a while. It was kind of nagging at me, but I wasn't doing anything about it. And then a couple of people asked me about it and they just sort of prodded me. And I decided I needed to get going again on it if I was going to write, not getting any younger, I guess. So I've been steadily writing and publishing since that time. And in 2017, I decided I wanted to try to put what I had together in a poetry manuscript in attempt to get it published. And so that's where the book came from.
It's interesting. I just wanted to say, Janice, it's interesting that you think of that period of time where you weren't writing as not being poetry, because when I met you, it was at a poetry reading at the public library when Pete Fairchild came to town, I believe.
Right.
And so in my mind, you've been writing poetry all along. It's interesting to hear you describe it as this kind of hiatus.
Well, when you met me, I mean, that was right after we moved here, I believe, within the first year. I hadn't really started full time at the paper, and I intended to keep writing at that time. But I have written ever since then, but just not that much poetry here and there. I've always been interested in it since then and read a lot. But yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that.
Yeah.
So during the time, one of the things that we always talk about is that your love for or your passion for writing never goes away. And if you wanted to do what you want to do, you kept at it. So well, you said that you started, again, going to what Rachel had said, that you probably took a little bit hiatus, but at the same time too, did you always just sort of kept writing? Was there always in the back of your mind when you were writing at the paper or where you were doing all the work, managing editing, or even when you went back to, because after the paper, you actually went back to the teaching. And were you writing on your own time as well?
I wrote some off and on during all of that time. Before we moved to Kansas, I had not gone to college, like I said, at the normal age. Instead, I got married and had 2 kids. And that, when you make choices like that, obviously it affects what you can do and where you can go. If I were to go back to that age, I mean, I think my dream would have been to go to New York and work for a magazine or something like that. But I sort of limited my choices. So I really got into writing when I was going to college, and I continued to write at the newspaper, I wrote a weekly column for a number of years, even after I left the newspaper. I always enjoyed that. And I worked some here and there on creative nonfiction, some, short essays, but I didn't really do anything as far as submitting anything. I took a lot of notes on poems during that time. Like some of the poems in the book go all the way back to notes I took when I was teaching at West Middle School here in Liberal, which was 2002. So there's a couple of poems in the book from that era that I went back and found my notes and thought, oh, I need to finish this. So I guess you could say I had the ideas and I was writing them down. I just didn't produce a lot of finished work in terms of poetry during those years.
Did you ever think of, instead of poetry, writing fiction or going down that path?
I have some short stories. I published one in the community college magazine back in Snyder when I was a student there. I had a fiction piece published in the Texas Tech student magazine. And I took a fiction class at Texas Tech. I liked writing fiction. I just don't think I'm as good at it as poetry. I've written some short stories since then, but I haven't really tried to publish them. I don't know. I used to, every time I would go to the eye doctor for the last few years, when Dr. Jury knew that I was working on poetry, he'd say, why don't you write something that makes money? Why don't you write a novel? And I would always say, just because I wrote a novel doesn't mean that I would make money off of it. I mean, I don't write primarily to try to make money. That's not, yeah, it would be great if somebody would give me $10,000, but that's pretty unusual, even if you write fiction. I mean, it's, not that many people succeed big time financially with writing.
So talk a little bit about poetry and what's the allure to that, as opposed to, let's say, writing a short story or a novel. What's the allure to you about poetry?
Poetry is much more concise and condensed. It depends on strong imagery. So I really like to focus on concrete imagery and also just paring it down, even though my poems are longer maybe than some people. Some of them run to, like a page and a half long or whatever. My poetry also maybe is, I would say it's a little bit more narrative than some people's poetry. I mean, there's a lot of narrative poetry out there, but you might think of each poem in the book almost as like a mini short story, a flash piece of fiction. But what sets it apart from actual fiction is, again, to me, the compression. When you read a poem, because every word is chosen carefully, that's where the layers of meaning come in. Sometimes the words do double or triple duty, and it's intended to be savored, I feel like, and read multiple times so that you can get more out of it. Whereas a short story, yes, I mean, there are short stories that I've read more than once, but mostly you read a story or you read a novel and you're done with it. Whereas poems, they're short, they're to the point, but you can get more out of them each time you read. And that's actually one thing I love about poetry.
I wanted to say something too, Janice, about your process of writing down notes and then coming back later to write the poem. That kind of goes along with what you're saying about how the poem ends up when it's finished, because you go back and revisit the information and the details. And so you're savoring it and kind of mulling it over. I've heard you describe it as a poem simmering in your mind. And then the reader gets to do that later on too, as you've described, because it's not just a one layer of meaning kind of experience.
Right.
Cool.
And even, I have a poem I'm working on right now that I thought was finished. I've already submitted it to several places, and I looked at it yesterday and I thought, maybe I need to cut those 3 lines out. So, I mean, it's hard. I guess we're getting off track a little bit here, but this is true probably of any kind of writing, but it's hard for me sometimes to ever feel like the work is finished, even pieces in the book. I mean, I haven't seen anything yet that I want to rip out of the book, but that is actually one of the things I enjoy about writing poetry is it can keep simmering and you can keep working on it and just make it hopefully better and better.
And so you think that there's a stigma with poetry in terms of the writing? Where you sort of said people sort of, I mean, oh, why don't you write this instead of that? And a lot of, a lot of people sort of kind of shy away from poetry because maybe sometimes it's too esoteric, sometimes it's really hard. How do you talk to, if you talk about people too, that like, how do you sort of go ahead and talk about a little bit about the imagery and such a decompression, but how would you sort of to talk to people who sort of kind of shy away from poetry?
Well, I would start by saying what I've already mentioned is that I hated poetry when I was growing up. And I think a lot of that just stems from the lack of appreciation of poetry in our society, although maybe that has actually changed a little bit. I mean, there seems to be sort of an upswing and an appreciation for it lately. But if you're not exposed to it a lot and you're not really taught how to read and appreciate it, then it's just, I feel like sometimes a foreign language to younger people. And poetry by its very nature, because it depends on symbolism and abstract meaning sometimes, not that the poem is abstract, it can be difficult for like younger kids sometimes to get. So I think it's just something that's pushed to the side in the school system sometimes because there's so much they have to cover. So, but I would just say, first of all, if you want to appreciate poetry, you have to read some of it. I mean, people just don't read much of it. And so, find a poet that you like, look online, get some recommendations from people that you know that do like poetry. Sometimes reading one particular poet or one particular book can sort of change your mind about poetry. So, and I mean, basically, when I was in college, I started reading a lot more of it. I met some people that were writing it, and I found out, hey, I mean, this is pretty cool. I actually do like it. So I just hadn't been exposed to it enough, I think, or in the right way in high school, maybe.
Okay, all right. So let's talk a little bit about your book, and let's talk a bit about now you've actually been published before, correct? In certain publications, and so how did you sort of let's talk about the process of getting the book together, how it all happened.
Well, like I said, had the idea in 2017 because this was a goal of mine from a long time ago. I mean, if I'm going to write and publish in journals and literary magazines, eventually I would also like to have a book. It's just kind of cool to have them all collected in one place so that people can read them and, your picture's on the back. That's pretty cool. My granddaughter noticed that. She's like, your picture is on there. So the book itself went through several variations and I learned a lot along the way. So I put it together at one point and started sending it out. And I was pretty naive because I just for some reason thought that, I could send it out to a few places and somebody was immediately going to snap up this poetry manuscript and say, yes, we want this. Well, that didn't happen. So, it was important to me to publish traditionally. And by that, I mean, send it out to publishers and not publish the book myself. There are plenty of people that do self-publish. And I mean, there's certainly a market from that. And there's some good books that are self-published. But when you go through the traditional process of submitting it, first of all, somebody is saying, yes, your work is good enough that we feel like you deserve to have a book. And then there's also someone that works with you every step of the way in getting the book into its best possible shape. So when I was still sending it out to all these different places, I tried different arrangements, different formats. I even sent it to someone that does what's called a manuscript consultation, where they will look at the manuscript and just kind of give you a sense of here's what's working, here's what's not. Maybe you could consider taking out these poems or rearranging these. And that was difficult for me to get the feedback on because at first I couldn't even figure out, it wasn't that the editor wasn't clear. It was just hard for me to wrap my mind around how to arrange the poems. But I learned something really important from that. She said, your poems need to be in conversation with one another as you go through the book, not here's all the poems from a certain year or here's all the poems together on a certain topic, but they need to flow and sort of talk to each other. And so when I started looking at it that way, I rearranged the book pretty radically, actually. I also submitted it under 2 or 3 different titles. When I finally sent it to this publisher, and the publisher is Lamar University Literary Press in Beaumont, Texas, they accepted the book, and then they assigned me an editor specifically to work on the manuscript. And I was pretty nervous about that, but this editor, she was the one that was doing like the line by line work with it, was actually an intern, but she was really great. She made some good suggestions. We did a little bit of rearranging, took a couple of poems out. We changed the book title. But she also made it really clear that I did not have to follow all of her suggestions. Like if I felt really strongly about something, I didn't have to change it. So that was really interesting. And that was a months-long process, just going through the book with her, basically poem by poem. She didn't really change a lot of the writing. There were a couple of places. Well, I'll give you an example, and I'll say this because we're in liberal, but I've used National Beef in a couple of poems, and she thought we should change that just because of the nature of the poems, because the poems have to do with undocumented immigrants. And she just thought it might go over better if we didn't use the name of a real company. So when you see those poems, you'll see it doesn't say National Beef, but you'll know that's what I meant.
But okay, so with that, how thrilling was it when you actually got the acceptance letter?
Okay, I'm sorry, ask that again.
When you found out that you got published, what was your what kind of emotions did you went through when you finally got that letter?
Oh, for the book, I was ecstatic because, to be honest, I was beginning to think it was never going to happen because I sent it to a number of different publishers and got no's. But I mean, from talking to other writers, that is pretty common also. Sometimes it can take years to get a book published. And so I was just ecstatic. I mean, I was really happy. I mean, I immediately, when I got the email, ran and told Bill, and he was pretty happy about it. I had some idea. So I first got an email from the head of the press who said, we really like it. And, you know, I think it's going to be a yes, but it has to go to a committee vote. Like they had a whole committee of editors that looked at it, and they all had to agree that they wanted to publish the book. So I was hopeful, but also a little nervous that they might say no, but they said yes. So
what was the original title, and how'd you guys come up with the title of your book?
The original title was Breaking City Ordinances, which is also a poem in the book, just like Some Electric Come. But the feedback I got from more than one person was, that's a great title, but it doesn't really give us a feel for what the whole collection might be about. They thought it was too specifically tied to this one poem. And I even got that information or that feedback from the editor that I sent the manuscript to for a consultation. She said, I come to this poem in the book and I'm expecting it to explain the collection, and it doesn't. So you need to change the title. So and my husband, Bill, actually helped me pinpoint which title might work better. We looked through the book and we were like, what about this? What about this? Because I decided I wanted to use one of the poem titles for the collection. And when he said Some Electric Hum, which is the poem that's set here in Liberal and is about sort of the poetic influence that I felt in the town, that's the hum. I said, that is it. And I sent that title to the publisher and the editor, and they're like, yes, that's the one. So we all just kind of immediately knew once we settled on that one that it was the right title. And I've had a lot of people tell me since that they really like the title. So that's always good.
So tell us about the book and the themes that run through. Is there one particular theme, or is there just a collection? How did you choose the poems that actually run through your book?
This book is a little bit unusual maybe from some people's in that it has poems that go all the way back to the early 90s that are some of the poems in the book were written in graduate school, and some of them were written as recently as just a couple of years ago. So because it spans such a long period of time, there are a lot of different periods in my life that it covers. There are 5 sections in the book, and each one is focused not necessarily on a time period, but just sort of thematic. The first section covers what I like to think of as outsiders. It's or the feeling of being an outsider. Section 2 focuses on being a parent, being a wife, going through the process of grief. There are a number of poems in the second section that deal with a divorce I went through and then the subsequent death of that ex-husband. In section 3, 4, and 5, those are a little bit chronological. Section 3, I would say, is more celebratory. It's about finding love again. A little hint, that was with Bill. So there are a number of poems about Bill in that section. And then section 4 and 5 sort of go back to my roots, and especially section 5 sort of focuses on writing and poetic influence. So there's not just one theme. It is sort of thematically limited to each section.
I want to say something here, which one thing I've really enjoyed about the book is how it reflects a perspective and a life lived that often we don't see it or hear it articulated so much in serious literature. You know, we live in what a lot of people call flyover country, and you grew up in a kind of rural, remote part of Texas, and you talk about these places in the world in a way that really brings them alive to someone who also grew up in this region, but I think makes it accessible to people. And it's really cool to read those poems and feel that sense of place that permeates the whole thing. So.
Thank you, Rachel. I do feel like there's a strong sense of place in the poems, and some of them are set in this area where we live right now, Southwest Kansas. A lot of them are set in West Texas, but these 2 areas are remarkably similar, I would say, in the landscape and also in the type of economy that is in both places, in the people, the political climate, just the, basic sort of good, hardworking farm people, oil field employees, and the isolation and sort of rural nature of both areas, this Southwest Kansas and Texas. When we moved to Liberal, I was really actually kind of shocked at how much like it was the place I had grown up, including it was really windy here, which is also true of where I grew up in Texas.
When you read your book, and you said that you've written some in graduate school all the way back then, what kind of emotions or things that you sort of flash back on, think like, oh wow, I wrote this when I was way back then, and now I'm reading now. What kind of emotions and feels do you get when you read that stuff? How do you sort of, do you get emotional when you read that? Do you go and say like, wow, I was pretty good back then. This is actually pretty good for someone writing back then, or like, geez, I could have been so much better. How do you feel about those things?
Well, first of all, it's not like I had, even though I wasn't actively focusing on writing a lot of poetry, I hadn't really forgotten about those poems. I mean, they were all still there. And I even had maybe just one of those published after I moved to Kansas. I'm trying to remember. So I look back on some of them, and I mean, not to sound arrogant, but I mean, there's a couple of them and I was like, wow, that's better than I remembered. And I won't say it's really good, but I mean, I was surprised, because I like to think I've grown some as a writer, but some of my early stuff, I mean, I don't know if you read through the book, if you can actually tell what was written 20 years ago and what was written 2 years ago. I mean, I think my style is changing more now. So if you read something that I wrote in the last few months, it's still narrative, but I think I'm moving a little bit more into lyrical, maybe not quite so, not so narrative. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that'll be for the second book.
Okay. How many poems do you have actually in this book?
Oh, I should have counted. Over 50, I think 52 or 53. It's 122 pages. So for a poetry book, it's slim because it's poetry, but it's often books are not quite this big. So I'm happy with what's in there. There's a lot of stuff. Something for everybody.
Okay, let's talk about this event that's coming up. You'll be doing a poetry reading at the Seward County Community College Showcase Theater on this Thursday, October 8th at 7 o'clock. So let's talk. So tell us a little bit about that.
First of all, I want to reassure people that maybe are a little nervous about coming in person that everyone is going to have a mask on, including me. So this is going to be interesting. We're having it in the theater so that we can spread out and people can social distance. It's limited to 45 people. So if you're nervous, we're also going to be live streaming it. But I do think it's going to be possible to be safe and feel comfortable there. We'll all have masks on and we'll be spread apart. I'm going to share poems from the new book, of course. Probably going to read for about 30 minutes. Then I'll take questions from the audience if anyone has any. And then we'll move outside the theater, keeping our mask on, and I'll be available to sign books. So we will have books for sale at the event. If you've already purchased a book, you're welcome to bring that with you and get it signed there as well. So I'm really excited to be sharing my poetry at Seward County Community College. This is basically the first in-person reading I've done since I've had the book. And it means a lot to me to do it at the college. That was my home for 11 years. And really, the Poetry Coffee House that we started there, bringing in some visiting poets, those actually probably played a role with me deciding to get going again on poetry. So people in this community and at the college have always been very supportive, for instance, when we've had the Poetry Coffee House. So I'm excited to share poems with Liberal.
Okay, and if for those who can't make it that night, we actually will be live streaming it, and it will be actually on the Seward County Community College Humanities Facebook page. So they'll be live streaming it as well, and we'll probably be sharing, so you can probably find it here as well, and probably eventually on YouTube. There you go.
There's the live stream. SCCC Humanities Division. So if you can't make it in person, I would love for you to join me on that page.
All right, and so let's get a little preview for the people who are watching. What do you got to read for us?
Okay, I had it marked and then I lost my place. So hold on a second. I'm going to read a poem called Wildcatter in a Dry County. This is one of my carnival poems. There are 5 what I call carnival poems scattered throughout the book. These poems could take place in Kansas or Texas. And for the most part, these are some of the few poems in the book that are not really based necessarily on an actual event. I've always had a soft spot in my heart for carnival workers. It seems just kind of I don't know how else to say it, sort of a sad life. It seems like a hard way to make a living. And it seemed like such a contrast to me that you go to the carnival and you have fun, you ride the rides, and then there are all these workers that are there. So this poem is part of that series, but it's actually about an oil field worker the morning after the carnival has left. And I have the same feeling about characters like this also. So this particular poem is set in Snyder, Texas, but again, it could have just as easily been set in this area back in the oil boom in the 50s. This is called Wildcatter in a Dry County. Carnival pulled out last night, and glistening greased chili dog wrappers catch the Sunday morning light as the old man stumbles through good times tossed on the ground. He noses through dusty ticket stubs and Coke cups coated in tobacco spit, thrusting the silver rod of a metal detector before him like a hard-on or a crutch. The town's closed down for church. It's just him and this rattling dowser. Each tick speeds his heart along, though he knows bottle caps and dimes to be the likely fines. Last month, he stirred loose a gold chain, 24-karat filigree. No one to give it to, but the promise of a solid strike beats faintly on in the dirt. Once, his blood pumped strong as a 30-barrel-a-day well, back in the 50s, the oil boom. A wildcatter could sink a few thousand into the ground and have it come up covered in crude, the sweet stench spicing his nights with women and celebrity. A photo hangs in the local museum. Bob Hope shaking his hand, smiling, partners on 12 wells. Only one came in a gusher, but that was enough. Until the oil played out and his woman hightailed it with a man in Lucchese boots. 40 years later, the pump jacks and drilling rigs have given way to churches pumping out salvation on every corner. Members congregate at the DQ to pick apart the sermon as a Sunday sandstorm scours his skin. He limps back to his rented room at the Palomar, wipes the grime from a few coins and his face, searching for something worth saving. The aquifer's going dry too, and he thinks of all that water sucked into church baptistries, so much to wash away the sins of the world that he's left with not one tear to water down the grit. Okay, that's one example of what you'll find in the book.
I had to unmute myself to say wow. It's good.
So we actually hope that we're going to be hearing a lot more of these poems over at the event on Thursday. And Rachel, do you have anything else that you want to add?
I just want to hear more, so I'm glad Thursday's coming. Okay,
and so again, if there are people there, I'm sure there are still tickets out over there, but if not, you can always watch on YouTube, on Facebook. They can contact Terry Barnes at the Humanities Division at 417-1451 to get tickets. And if they can't come out over there, watch. There you go. It's free.
I'm going to say also, last time I checked, we did not have that many reservations. So if you're thinking you're not going to come because it's full, at least call and check. I mean, it's fine with me if we don't have 45 people, but there's plenty of space left, or at least there was on Friday. So give her a call and reserve your spot.
And I want to say that I think that's really awesome that if they can't make it over, but I mean, there's nothing like big to be actually there live and to actually hear the person speaking, especially Janice, when she's actually speaking. And when she reads her poetry, you can sort of tell that the emotions there, the actual passions there, and each one has such a special meaning. She's going to convey that to you. And I think that, you can see it on TV, you can see it on YouTube or the rest of it, but there's nothing like being there in person and actually seeing it. And it would be great too to come on out and meet Janice. She's quite an awesome individual, as Rachel and I can attest to. And you get a chance to meet her. And we hope that this little interview gave you a little bit of insight into her. And she gets her mask on. And so that's right.
I'm ready.
You see, we hear you perfectly, and that'll be great. So, Janice, we look forward to seeing you on Thursday at 7 o'clock. And we hope that everyone else will come on out and be there.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, guys. I hope to see you all at 7 o'clock at Seward County Community College.
All right. Great talk to you, Janice. We'll see you then.